Some truths wait for the worst possible moment to be heard. Every seat inside St. Bartholomew's Cathedral was filled long before the ceremony was scheduled to begin. The kind of crowd gathered there that afternoon wasn't just family and friends. It was editors from fashion magazines, investors from Manhattan boardrooms, social media personalities with millions of followers, and designers who had built their reputations around one name: Caldwell. The air carried the faint scent of white orchids arranged along the aisle, their petals glowing softly beneath rows of suspended crystal lights. At the front of the cathedral stood Adrian Caldwell, motionless, composed, his tailored charcoal tuxedo cut with the same precision that made his fashion empire worth billions. Adrian wasn't just another CEO. At 38, he was the face of Caldwell Atelier, the man whose collections closed Paris Fashion Week and whose name turned simple fabrics into global trends. Cameras were everywhere. Some were official media cameras stationed near the back of the cathedral, their lenses pointed steadily toward the altar. Others were phones, raised discreetly above silk programs and designer handbags. The wedding of Adrian Caldwell had become one of the most anticipated society events of the year. Outside, along Madison Avenue, black SUVs lined the curb for nearly half a block. Inside, whispers floated gently through the cathedral like quiet currents of wind. People speculated about the dress, about the ring, about the woman who had managed to capture the attention of a man known for guarding his private life like a fortress. Naomi Brooks. At the far end of the aisle, just behind the cathedral doors, Naomi stood with her father, her hands wrapped carefully around a bouquet of ivory roses. The satin layers of her wedding gown caught the light with every small movement she made. It was elegant without being excessive, designed by one of Adrian's own creative directors, tailored to fit her like it had been sketched directly onto her silhouette. Yet the beauty of the moment pressed heavily against her chest. Her breathing remained steady, but deep beneath the fabric and lace, something invisible weighed on her thoughts. Naomi wasn't nervous in the way brides usually were. She wasn't worried about tripping on the aisle or forgetting her vows. Her concern lived somewhere deeper, somewhere quieter, in a place where memory and truth sometimes collided without warning. The music began, a soft swell, from a string quartet seated near the front pews. Conversations dimmed immediately as hundreds of heads turned toward the cathedral entrance. The doors opened slowly, allowing afternoon sunlight to spill across the marble floor in a wide band of pale gold. Naomi stepped forward, cameras tilted slightly to follow her movement. The train of her gown drifted across the aisle behind her like a quiet tide of white silk. Adrian lifted his eyes. From where he stood at the altar, Naomi looked almost unreal beneath the cathedral lights. Her posture was calm, her gaze steady, her expression composed in a way that drew attention without demanding it. For a brief moment, the noise of the room seemed to fade entirely. The board meetings, the interviews, the endless schedule that governed Adrian's life disappeared into silence as he watched her approach. But the quiet inside his mind lasted only seconds. Because 5 minutes earlier, while standing alone in a private chamber behind the altar, Adrian Caldwell had received a message. It arrived on his phone without warning. No name, no number attached. Just a single line of text that appeared against the glowing screen. You're about to marry a woman who already gave you a son. Adrian had stared at the message longer than he expected to. Not because he believed it immediately, but because something about the words refused to disappear from his thoughts. In his world, anonymous messages weren't unusual. Rival executives sometimes played games. Competitors leaked rumors. Fashion houses were known for turning even the smallest whisper into a scandal. Normally, he would have ignored it, deleted it, continued with the ceremony without giving it another second of attention. But this message had arrived with a photograph. Adrian hadn't opened it yet. Not fully. Only long enough to see the corner of a small face partially hidden beneath a knitted hat. A child's face. The eyes in that photograph had stopped him cold. Naomi continued walking toward the altar. Her heels moved across the polished marble floor with quiet precision, each step measured, each breath controlled. She could feel the eyes of the room watching her, yet she didn't allow herself to glance toward the crowd. Her focus remained forward, on the man waiting beneath the cathedral lights. Adrian Caldwell, the man she had once believed would change the course of her life long before this wedding was. ever planned. The man who now stood only a few steps away. When Naomi finally reached the altar, the music softened to a gentle echo inside the high stone ceiling. The priest offered a warm smile as he prepared to begin the ceremony. Adrian did not return the smile. Instead, his gaze studied Naomi's face with a level of quiet intensity that felt different from the calm expression he had worn moments earlier. Naomi noticed immediately. It was subtle, but unmistakable. Something had shifted in his expression. The priest cleared his throat softly, preparing to speak the opening words of the ceremony. But before he could begin, Adrian stepped forward slightly. The movement was small, yet the change in the room was immediate. Naomi's fingers tightened around her bouquet. Adrian leaned closer, his voice low enough that only she could hear it. "Did you hide something from me?" Naomi blinked once, confusion flickering briefly across her expression. "Adrian." His tone remained calm, but the stillness behind his eyes had hardened. "Answer me," he said quietly. Naomi felt the room pressing around them. Hundreds of people waiting for a ceremony that had already begun to unravel in ways none of them could yet see. She opened her mouth to speak, but Adrian had already straightened his posture. His gaze lifted from Naomi's face and shifted toward the crowd filling the cathedral pews. Cameras remained pointed at the altar. Phones hovered in the air like silent witnesses. The priest hesitated, sensing the sudden tension. Adrian Caldwell inhaled once, slowly, the way a man does when preparing to say something that cannot be taken back. When he spoke again, his voice carried clearly through the cathedral. "This wedding is over." The words dropped into the room like a sudden break in the music. Gasps rippled through the audience. Phones rose higher. Naomi did not move. She did not step back or lower her head. She simply stood there, the bouquet still held carefully in her hands, her expression calm even as whispers began to spread across the cathedral. Adrian turned toward her again, the message still glowing faintly in his mind. The photograph he had not yet opened fully. The eyes of a child that looked too familiar to dismiss. And for the first time since Naomi Brooks walked into his life, Adrian Caldwell felt the fragile edge of certainty beginning to fracture. Beneath his feet, for a moment no one inside the cathedral moved. The silence that followed Adrian Caldwell's words felt heavier than the music that had filled the room only seconds earlier. Hundreds of guests sat frozen in their seats as whispers began spreading from pew to pew like a quiet storm building beneath the polished calm of the ceremony. The string quartet had stopped playing entirely, their bows hovering uncertainly above the strings. Naomi Brooks remained exactly where she stood, her hands still holding the bouquet of ivory roses, her shoulders straight, her expression calm in a way that almost seemed impossible under the weight of so many watching eyes. The cameras did not turn away. If anything, they leaned closer. The wedding of Adrian Caldwell had been expected to dominate society pages and fashion headlines for weeks, but no one had imagined the moment would unfold like this. Adrian stood at the altar with the composure of a man who had spent his entire adult life controlling rooms far more intimidating than this one. Boardrooms filled with investors worth billions. Runways watched by critics who could destroy a designer's reputation with a single article. Yet even he could feel the temperature of the cathedral shifting around him. Because the truth was simple. Adrian Caldwell did not make impulsive decisions. Every move he made had always been measured, strategic, deliberate. People built entire careers predicting his next business decision. Fashion editors analyzed his runway, shows the way historians examined political speeches. When Adrian Caldwell spoke, the industry listened. Naomi knew that better than anyone. She had seen it for herself long before this day. 2 years earlier, Adrian had been standing in a completely different room under completely different lights when their lives first collided in a way neither of them expected. It had been a fashion industry charity gala at the Plaza Hotel. The ballroom had been filled with photographers and executives and designers hoping to secure a moment of Adrian's attention. Naomi had not been there as a guest. She had been working behind the scenes as part of the event coordination team, responsible for managing the schedule and guiding speakers toward the stage at the correct time. She remembered the moment clearly because Adrian had arrived 20 minutes later than planned. Not dramatically late, just late enough to make everyone else nervous. When he stepped through the ballroom doors, the atmosphere shifted almost instantly. Conversations lowered. Cameras turned. Naomi had looked up from the tablet in her hands just long enough to see the crowd rearrange itself around him like water shifting around a stone. Adrian Caldwell carried a quiet gravity with him. Not arrogance, not performance, simply presence. When he walked into a room, people noticed. That night, Naomi had been the one responsible for guiding him to the stage. She had approached him carefully, clipboard in hand, introducing herself with calm professionalism even while several designers nearby tried to interrupt with greetings and questions. Adrian had noticed something immediately. Naomi Brooks did not treat him like a celebrity. She did not hesitate, but she also did not fawn over him the way many people did. She spoke clearly, efficiently, directing him toward the stage entrance while explaining the schedule for the evening's presentations. He had followed her without argument. Later that night, he had remembered her name. That alone was unusual. Adrian met thousands of people every year. Yet Naomi Brooks remained in his memory. Perhaps it was her calm voice. Perhaps it was the way she looked directly at him without the usual mixture of admiration or ambition that often filled conversations around him. Or perhaps it was simply the first moment in years when someone spoke to Adrian Caldwell as if he were just another man standing in the room. Their second meeting had not been planned. 3 weeks after the gala, Adrian visited the design office late in the evening to review a new collection. When he stepped into the elevator lobby, he saw Naomi standing near the security desk speaking with one of the assistants. She had recently accepted a temporary position helping coordinate several events for Caldwell Atelier. Adrian remembered the way she looked surprised when the elevator doors opened and he stepped out. Not nervous, not starstruck, simply surprised. The conversation that followed had been brief, but strangely easy. Adrian asked about the upcoming charity campaign. Naomi explained the schedule and logistics with the same calm clarity he remembered from the gala. That was the beginning. Their meetings became occasional conversations. Conversations became late evening discussions after events. Eventually, those quiet moments turned into something deeper, something neither of them had expected when their paths first crossed in that crowded ballroom. Naomi had always understood Adrian's world carried enormous pressure. Every decision he made affected thousands of employees and millions of dollars in business. Yet when Adrian was with her, he sometimes seemed different, quieter, less guarded, as if for a short time the constant expectations surrounding him could fade into the background. But even then there were signs Naomi noticed. Adrian rarely spoke about his family. When he did, the subject ended quickly. The Caldwell name carried influence across the fashion industry for decades. But with that influence came strict expectations about reputation, legacy, and public image. Naomi had never fully understood the depth of those expectations until the night Adrian disappeared from her life without warning. It happened after a board meeting that lasted nearly 6 hours. Adrian sent a short message saying he needed time to handle a situation involving the company and that he would explain everything soon. Naomi waited. Days passed, then weeks. His phone remained silent. The world outside continued moving forward while Naomi tried to understand how a man who once spoke to her with quiet honesty could vanish so completely. She never learned the full reason. Not then. Now inside the cathedral, the distance between them felt heavier than the marble floor beneath their feet. Adrian watched Naomi carefully as whispers continued spreading through the crowd. He could see the confusion in her eyes, but also something else. A calm strength that refused to collapse under the pressure of public attention. Naomi Brooks had never been fragile. Adrian knew that. The message on his phone still burned quietly in his thoughts. You are about to marry a woman who already gave you a son. Adrian had not shown the photograph yet. He had not spoken about the message in front of the crowd. But the question now stood between them like an invisible wall. Naomi's voice finally broke the silence, steady and controlled. Adrian, what are you talking about? Her tone was quiet enough that only the first few rows could hear her clearly, but the tension inside the cathedral made every word feel amplified. Adrian held her gaze. His voice lowered again, calm but firm. 2 years ago, after I left, did you have a child? Naomi's breath paused for the smallest fraction of a second. It was a moment so subtle that most people in the room did not notice. Adrian did. And in that brief silence, the certainty inside his mind shifted from suspicion to something much heavier. Something real. The silence between Adrian Caldwell and Naomi Brooks stretched across the cathedral like a fragile thread pulled too tight. Hundreds of guests remained seated in stunned stillness, unsure whether they were witnessing a private conversation that had accidentally slipped into public view or the beginning of something far more serious. The sunlight pouring through the cathedral windows had shifted slightly, sliding across the polished marble floor until the light reached the edge of Naomi's dress. The ivory fabric shimmered softly beneath it, yet Naomi herself did not move. Adrian's question lingered in the air between them. 2 years ago, after I left, did you have a child? Naomi's breath remained steady, but her fingers tightened slightly around the stems of the roses she held. The bouquet had been carefully arranged only an hour earlier in a private room near the cathedral entrance. Now the white petals trembled almost imperceptibly as Naomi considered the weight of the moment. She could hear whispers rising again behind her. Not loud, not chaotic, just the quiet murmur of people realizing that the story unfolding before them had nothing to do with wedding vows anymore. Naomi lifted her eyes slowly to meet Adrian's. His expression had not changed. It was the same calm, controlled composure that had built Caldwell Atelier into one of the most influential fashion houses in the world. Yet she could see something else beneath it now. Not anger, not accusation, something closer to uncertainty. Naomi spoke quietly. Yes. The single word carried farther through the cathedral than she expected. Even the guests seated near the back could feel the shift that followed. Adrian did not react immediately. His posture remained perfectly straight, his hands resting loosely at his sides, his gaze fixed on Naomi's face. But the silence that followed her answer was no longer empty. It was filled with understanding that had begun to move through the room like a slow ripple. Naomi continued speaking before anyone else could interrupt the moment. I found out 3 weeks after you disappeared. The confession hung in the air with quiet clarity. Naomi did not lower her eyes as she said it. She did not attempt to soften the truth or hide behind vague explanations. She simply told the truth the way she always had when she spoke to Adrian. Directly. The priest standing beside them shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to step forward or remain silent. He chose silence. This was no longer a ceremony he could guide. Adrian's voice remained calm when he spoke again, but it carried a deeper weight now. And you never told me. Naomi shook her head once. I tried. The words landed softly but firmly. Adrian's eyes narrowed slightly. Naomi continued before he could respond. I called your office. Your assistant told me you were not taking personal calls. I left messages. No one answered. Naomi paused for a moment, remembering the endless days she had spent waiting beside a silent phone in a small apartment on the Upper West Side. Outside the cathedral windows, the faint sound of city traffic drifted through the air, reminding everyone that Manhattan continued moving forward even while the moment inside seemed frozen in place. I even went to your building once, Naomi said quietly. Security told me you were traveling overseas for business. Adrian felt something tighten inside his chest. The memory of that time in his life returned with uncomfortable clarity. 2 years earlier, Caldwell Atelier had faced the most aggressive corporate takeover attempt in its history. Rival investors had tried to force control of the company by attacking its stock price and pressuring board members to sell their shares. Adrian had spent nearly 4 months moving between New York, Paris, and London, negotiating with partners and investors while the media speculated about the future of his company. During that time, his personal life had disappeared entirely beneath the pressure of protecting the business his family had built for decades. Naomi's voice continued, steady and calm despite the crowd watching every word. After a while I realized something. Adrian asked quietly, what? Naomi's eyes held his without hesitation. I realized that if you wanted to find me, you would have. The sentence was not bitter. It was simply honest. Adrian felt the quiet truth of it settle into the space between them. Around them, the whispers among the guests had grown slightly louder, though still controlled. Several phones remained raised in the air, recording the moment as it unfolded. Yet Naomi did not appear concerned with any of them. Her attention remained entirely on Adrian. The bouquet in her hands lowered slowly until it rested against the front of her dress. The cathedral lights reflected in her eyes, giving them a calm brightness that made her words feel even more grounded. Adrian asked the question that had been building in his mind since her first answer. Is the child mine? Naomi did not hesitate this time. Yes. The word carried through the cathedral like the quiet closing of a door that could never be reopened. Adrian inhaled slowly, the breath controlled but deeper than before. The message on his phone no longer felt like an accusation. It felt like confirmation. Yet another question pushed forward through his thoughts. Where is he? Naomi's expression softened slightly. With someone I trust. Adrian studied her carefully. His mind had always been trained to notice details others overlooked. The way a designer's stitching revealed the true quality of a garment. The subtle changes in a negotiation that signaled when someone was hiding information. He noticed the choice of Naomi's words immediately. Not with family. Not with a babysitter. With someone I trust. Adrian asked quietly who. Naomi did not answer right away. Instead, she glanced briefly toward the cathedral entrance. The movement was small, but Adrian followed her gaze instinctively. The large wooden doors at the back of the cathedral remained closed. Yet Naomi's calm expression suggested she was expecting something. Or someone. Adrian looked back at her. You brought him here. Naomi nodded once. I did not want you to hear about him from strangers. Adrian's voice dropped lower. Then why not tell me before today? Naomi's answer came with quiet certainty. Because I needed to see whether you would choose truth or reputation when it mattered most. The words settled into Adrian's thoughts with unexpected weight. Around them, the cathedral remained filled with people who had come expecting a wedding and now found themselves witnessing a moment far more complicated than celebration. Adrian Caldwell stood at the altar of a cathedral filled with cameras and industry leaders, while the woman he once loved calmly revealed the existence of a child he had never known. And somewhere beyond the closed doors at the back of the room, a small boy waited quietly, unaware that the man standing beneath the cathedral lights was his father. The cathedral doors at the back of the room had not yet opened, but suddenly everyone inside seemed aware that something was about to change. Naomi Brooks stood at the altar beneath the soft glow of the cathedral lights, her posture still composed, her expression calm despite the quiet storm of whispers spreading through the crowd. Adrian Caldwell remained only a few feet away from her, yet the distance between them now felt larger than the entire length of the aisle. The air inside the cathedral carried a strange tension, the kind that settles into a room when hundreds of people realize they are witnessing a moment no one had planned but no one could ignore. Adrian's eyes remained fixed on Naomi. Her last words echoed in his thoughts with unsettling clarity. Somewhere beyond the closed doors at the back of the room, a small boy waited quietly. A boy Naomi had just confirmed was his son. Adrian had built his life on control. Every major decision he had ever made was carefully calculated. Yet this moment stood far outside anything he could have predicted. Around them the guests remained seated, though several leaned slightly forward in their seats, drawn toward the unfolding conversation as if it were impossible to look away. Naomi lowered the bouquet in her hands and gently set it on a nearby pedestal beside the altar. The roses rested against the polished surface, their white petals bright beneath the cathedral lights. When she lifted her hands again, they were steady. Adrian noticed that immediately. Naomi Brooks was not trembling, not collapsing under the pressure of the moment. She stood the same way she always had when life placed something difficult in front of her. With quiet dignity. Adrian spoke carefully. How old is he? Naomi answered without hesitation. 2 years. Adrian felt the number settle heavily into his thoughts. 2 years. That meant the child had been born only months after he disappeared during the crisis that nearly shattered Caldwell Atelier. Adrian remembered those months clearly. Endless flights between cities. Meetings that lasted until sunrise. Lawyers, investors, negotiations that stretched across time zones. The world had expected him to protect the company his family built. And he had done exactly that. But somewhere during those same months Naomi had been carrying a child. His child. Adrian's voice lowered slightly. What is his name? Naomi's expression softened for the first time since the ceremony began. Micah. The name moved quietly through the air between them. Adrian repeated it silently in his mind. Micah. The sound of the name felt unfamiliar, yet strangely personal at the same time. Adrian glanced toward the cathedral entrance again. The tall wooden doors remained closed, yet the anticipation inside the room had grown noticeably stronger. Naomi followed his gaze. She could sense the tension rising among the guests as well. The world Adrian lived in thrived on stories. Fashion magazines built headlines around the smallest personal details of industry leaders. Social media could turn a single moment into a global spectacle within minutes. Naomi knew exactly what kind of story this could become. Yet she did not appear worried. Adrian looked back at her. Does he know about me? Naomi shook her head gently. Not yet. Adrian felt something shift inside his chest at those words. Naomi continued quietly. He knows there is someone important I wanted him to meet today. Adrian studied her face. Why today? Naomi's answer came without hesitation. Because today you promised to start a life with me in front of everyone who matters in your world. Adrian absorbed the meaning behind her words. Naomi had not chosen this moment randomly. She had chosen the one moment when Adrian Caldwell would stand in front of the entire society that defined his reputation. Adrian asked another question, though his voice carried less certainty than before. You planned this. Naomi met his gaze directly. I plan to tell you the truth. The cathedral doors suddenly shifted with a faint wooden creak that echoed softly through the room. Several guests turned immediately toward the sound. Adrian did the same. The doors opened slowly, allowing another stream of pale afternoon light to spill across the marble floor. A man stepped through first, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a dark navy suit that fit with understated precision. Adrian recognized him immediately. Daniel Hayes. A quiet murmur passed through the crowd as people realized who had just entered the cathedral. Daniel Hayes was not only a successful businessman. He was Adrian Caldwell's most visible competitor in the fashion industry. The founder of Hayes Collective, a company that had grown from a small New York studio into one of the fastest rising brands in American fashion. The rivalry between Caldwell Atelier and Hayes Collective had been the subject of countless industry articles. Yet Daniel Hayes did not look toward the crowd when he entered the cathedral. His attention remained focused ahead of him as he walked slowly down the aisle. Beside him, holding his hand, walked a small boy. The child could not have been older than 2. He wore a tiny gray jacket over a white shirt and dark trousers, the kind of simple outfit chosen for a formal occasion, but still comfortable enough for a toddler. His steps were careful but curious as he looked around the enormous cathedral with wide eyes. The sunlight from the doorway framed him for a moment before the doors closed quietly behind them. Naomi's voice carried gently across the altar. Adrian, that is Micah. Adrian did not move. The boy walking down the aisle had a small, steady stride. One hand held Daniel Hayes's finger for balance, while the other clutched a small wooden toy car. His dark curls framed his face as he glanced up occasionally at the towering ceilings above him. Adrian felt his breath pause slightly as the child moved closer. There was something about the boy's face that pulled at Adrian's attention immediately. The shape of the eyes. The quiet seriousness in his expression even while he explored the unfamiliar room around him. The child stopped briefly halfway down the aisle, distracted by the echo of footsteps on the marble floor. Daniel Hayes crouched slightly beside him and spoke softly, guiding him forward again with patient calm. The guests seated along the aisle had fallen completely silent now. No whispers, no movement, just the quiet sound of a small pair of shoes tapping gently against marble as the child continued toward the altar where Adrian Caldwell stood waiting without realizing he had been waiting his entire life for this moment. The sound of Micah's small shoes tapping softly against the marble floor echoed through the cathedral with surprising clarity. In a room filled with hundreds of powerful voices from the fashion world, that quiet rhythm suddenly felt louder than anything else. Adrian Caldwell did not move as the child continued walking down the long aisle beside Daniel Hayes. The sunlight that had spilled through the cathedral doors now stretched across the marble like a pale ribbon, catching the edges of the boy's small jacket and the curls of dark hair above his forehead. Every step the child took pulled the attention of the entire room forward. The guests seated in the pews had stopped whispering entirely. Even the cameras that had been recording since the ceremony began now seemed to hold their breath, their lenses fixed on the unexpected scene unfolding before them. Daniel Hayes walked slowly, giving the child time to keep his balance. He did not look toward the crowd, and he did not acknowledge the dozens of familiar faces watching him with disbelief. His attention remained focused on Micah, guiding him gently along the aisle with the calm patience of someone who had done this many times before. Naomi Brooks stood at the altar watching them approach. For the first time since the confrontation began, her expression carried a trace of warmth. Not relief, not triumph, Simply the quiet tenderness of a mother watching her child walk into a room full of strangers without fear. Adrian's eyes remained locked on the boy. At first he had only noticed the child's presence. The small frame, the curious way Micah looked around the towering cathedral ceiling. But as the distance between them shortened, Adrian began to see details that made something deep inside his chest tighten. The shape of the child's eyes was familiar, not identical to his own, but close enough to stir recognition that he could not ignore. The boy's expression carried the same quiet focus Adrian had seen reflected in his own childhood photographs, the same thoughtful pause before each new step. Micah stopped briefly again halfway down the aisle. He lifted the small wooden car in his hand and examined one of its wheels, as if the enormous cathedral surrounding him had suddenly become less interesting than the toy he was holding. Daniel crouched beside him with a patient smile and spoke softly. The boy listened for a moment, then nodded with the serious determination that only very young children could carry. Together they continued walking toward the altar. Naomi's voice reached Adrian again, gentle but steady. "He likes cars." Adrian glanced toward her briefly, surprised by the quiet normalcy of the comment in the middle of such an extraordinary moment. Naomi continued softly. "That toy has been his favorite for months." Adrian looked back at the boy approaching them. Something about Naomi's voice made the reality of the situation settle deeper into his thoughts. This was not a rumor. Not a rumor designed to damage his reputation or create headlines for the fashion press. This was a child who had been living somewhere in the world for 2 years without Adrian knowing. He existed. Daniel Hayes reached the final row of pews near the altar and slowed his pace even further. Micah glanced up at him and then toward Naomi, recognizing her instantly. The boy's face brightened with a small, quiet smile that carried across the short distance between them. Naomi took one step forward, her wedding dress shifting softly across the marble floor. "Hello, sweetheart," she said warmly. Micah released Daniel's hand and toddled the final few steps toward her. Naomi knelt carefully so the large layers of her dress would not trip the child. Micah walked directly into her arms without hesitation, wrapping his small arms around her neck with the complete trust that only young children possess. The moment lasted only a few seconds, yet it carried a quiet power that none of the guests in the cathedral could ignore. Naomi kissed the top of Micah's curls and whispered something softly that only he could hear. The boy laughed quietly, the sound bright and innocent against the heavy tension that had filled the room only moments earlier. Adrian watched the interaction without speaking. His mind struggled to keep pace with what he was seeing. Naomi stood again, lifting Micah easily onto her hip. The child rested comfortably against her shoulder, still holding the small wooden car in one hand. Naomi turned slowly until she was facing Adrian again. Micah followed her gaze with curiosity. The boy studied Adrian for a moment with the open interest that children often showed when meeting someone new. Adrian felt something shift in his chest again. For a man who had negotiated billion-dollar contracts without hesitation, he suddenly found himself unsure of the simplest action. Daniel Hayes stepped closer to the altar, stopping a respectful distance away. His expression remained calm, almost neutral, though the quiet tension between him and Adrian was impossible to miss. Adrian finally spoke. His voice was lower than before, stripped of the sharp authority that had filled the cathedral only minutes earlier. "You brought him here with Daniel Hayes." Naomi answered calmly. "Daniel helped me when I had no one else." Adrian's eyes moved toward Daniel briefly. The two men had faced each other across boardroom tables and fashion industry panels for years, each representing rival empires competing for influence in the same world. Yet the man standing before him now looked less like a competitor and more like someone who had simply stepped into a difficult situation and offered help where none had existed. Adrian returned his attention to the child. Micah was still studying him with curious eyes. The boy tilted his head slightly, as if trying to decide whether this tall stranger standing beneath the cathedral lights was someone interesting or someone ordinary. Naomi spoke softly to Micah. "Sweetheart, this is the person I told you about." Micah looked back at Adrian again, then raised the wooden car in his hand as if offering it for inspection. The simple gesture carried a quiet innocence that felt almost overwhelming in the middle of such a complicated moment. Adrian hesitated for the smallest fraction of a second before stepping forward. The marble floor echoed faintly beneath his shoes as he closed the short distance between them. Naomi remained still, allowing the moment to unfold naturally. Adrian knelt slightly, so that his eyes were level with the child's. For the first time since the ceremony had begun, Adrian Caldwell felt the familiar structure of his carefully controlled life shift beneath his feet in a way that could not be reversed. The boy studying him with quiet curiosity was not a rumor or a possibility anymore. He was real, and the more Adrian looked at Micah's face, the more he realized the truth Naomi had spoken earlier was written clearly in the child's eyes. Adrian Caldwell remained kneeling for a moment that felt longer than anyone inside the cathedral expected. The marble floor beneath him reflected the soft cathedral lights, and the quiet weight of the moment pressed gently against the hundreds of people watching from the pews. Micah continued studying him with open curiosity, holding the small wooden car toward him as if the gesture were the most natural introduction in the world. Adrian looked at the toy first, then slowly lifted his gaze back to the child's face. The resemblance was no longer something his mind could question. It was subtle but undeniable. The shape of the child's eyes carried the same focused calm Adrian had seen in photographs of himself as a boy. The slight curve of Micah's eyebrows, the thoughtful way he paused before moving, even the quiet seriousness in the child's gaze felt strangely familiar. Adrian reached out carefully and touched the wooden car Micah was holding. He did not take it from the child's hand, only rested his fingers against it for a moment as if acknowledging the offering. Micah watched the movement closely, then nodded once with the satisfied expression of someone who had completed an important introduction. Naomi Brooks remained standing beside them, holding Micah gently against her shoulder. The cathedral lights shimmered across the fabric of her dress as she watched the moment unfold with quiet attention. She had imagined this moment many times during the past 2 years. Sometimes it happened in a small living room while Micah played on the floor. Sometimes it appeared in her thoughts late at night when the apartment was silent and the city outside her window hummed with distant traffic. In those imagined moments, Adrian's reaction was never the same twice. Sometimes he was angry, sometimes distant, sometimes surprised in ways she could not predict. But she had never imagined the stillness now filling the cathedral as father and son looked at one another for the first time. Adrian spoke softly. "Hello, Micah." The child's expression brightened slightly at hearing his name. Micah shifted in Naomi's arms and held the wooden car forward again, this time pushing it gently toward Adrian's hand. Adrian accepted it slowly, examining the small toy as if it were far more valuable than the polished marble surrounding them. It was a simple object, painted blue, slightly worn along the edges, the wheels showing the small marks of frequent play across living room floors. Adrian rolled the car lightly across his palm before handing it back to the boy. Micah accepted it proudly, gripping it again with quiet satisfaction. The exchange lasted only a few seconds, yet something in Adrian's posture had changed by the time he stood again. He rose slowly to his full height, the controlled confidence that once defined every movement now softened by something new. Not weakness, not confusion, something closer to awareness. Adrian looked at Naomi. "Why did you trust Daniel Hayes to help you?" Naomi answered calmly. "Because when you disappeared, he was the only person who did not pretend I was invisible." A quiet ripple passed through the crowd as those words settled into the room. Adrian glanced briefly toward Daniel Hayes, who remained standing a few feet away with composed patience. Daniel did not look triumphant or defensive. He simply stood there with the calm posture of someone who understood that the moment belonged to Naomi and the child, not to him. Adrian spoke again. "You asked him for help." Naomi nodded slightly. "I asked many people for help. Most of them were too busy protecting their connection to you. Daniel Hayes was the only one who listened." Adrian considered that for a moment. The world he lived in revolved around alliances and reputation. Loyalty in that world was often tied to influence and opportunity. Naomi's words suggested that during the months after his disappearance, she had been standing alone in a society that measured people by the power they carried. Daniel finally spoke, his voice steady but respectful. Naomi did not ask for much. She asked for a place to stay for a few weeks and help finding a doctor she could trust. Adrian looked toward him again. "And you gave it to her?" Daniel answered simply, "Yes." Adrian studied the man for a moment longer. The rivalry between their companies had shaped countless articles and industry conversations over the years, yet the reality standing in front of him now felt far removed from those headlines. Adrian returned his attention to Naomi and Micah. The boy had grown comfortable again in Naomi's arms, now examining the cathedral ceiling with quiet fascination while absent-mindedly rolling the wooden car across Naomi's shoulder. Adrian spoke carefully. "Why bring him here today?" Naomi's answer carried the same calm certainty it had from the beginning. "Because today you stood in front of everyone who defines your world and promised to build a future with me." Adrian said nothing for several seconds. Naomi continued gently. "I wanted the truth to stand in the same room as that promise." The meaning behind her words settled heavily into the cathedral. Adrian Caldwell had spent years protecting his reputation in an industry where perception could shape fortunes overnight. Yet Naomi had chosen this moment to place something far more personal beside that reputation. Adrian looked down at Micah again. The boy noticed his attention and lifted the wooden car proudly once more. Adrian felt an unexpected warmth rise quietly through his chest. He reached out and touched Micah's small hand, careful not to startle him. The boy did not pull away. Instead, he examined Adrian's watch with the serious curiosity that young children often give to unfamiliar objects. Naomi watched the interaction silently. The guests seated in the pews had begun whispering again, though more softly now, as if recognizing that the moment unfolding at the altar carried a gravity beyond gossip or headlines. Adrian finally spoke again, his voice steady but different from before. "I should have known." Naomi tilted her head slightly. "Known what?" Adrian looked between her and the child. "That the world does not stop moving just because I am fighting to control it." Naomi's expression softened slightly at those words. Micah yawned gently, resting his head against Naomi's shoulder as if the long walk through the cathedral had already exhausted his energy. Adrian looked at the child again and realized something quietly profound. For 2 years Micah had been growing, learning, laughing somewhere in the world while Adrian Caldwell traveled between cities chasing deals and defending a company name. The realization did not feel like regret yet. It felt like awareness. And awareness had a way of changing everything. The cathedral remained suspended in a fragile stillness as Adrian Caldwell stood only a few feet from Naomi Brooks, and the child resting quietly against her shoulder. The moment had stretched far beyond the ceremony that was supposed to take place beneath the tall, stained glass windows. Outside, the afternoon light had begun to shift across the city skyline, but inside the cathedral time felt almost paused. Adrian looked at Micah again, and this time he noticed something he had not allowed himself to see before. The child was not nervous. He was not confused by the enormous room filled with strangers in elegant clothes. Instead, he seemed quietly comfortable, the way children often did when they trusted the person holding them. Micah rested his cheek against Naomi's shoulder, his small hand still gripping the blue wooden car, while his eyes studied Adrian with curious patience. Adrian realized something unexpected in that moment. The boy was not waiting for approval. He was simply observing the man standing in front of him, the way a child studies a new presence without the complicated expectations adults often carry. Adrian spoke softly again, his voice lower than before. "Micah." The boy lifted his head slightly when he heard his name, his eyes bright with recognition. Adrian hesitated for a moment before speaking again, careful with every word. "Do you like cars?" Micah nodded with quiet enthusiasm, lifting the wooden toy proudly, as if answering the question required proof. Naomi smiled faintly at the gesture. "He loves them." Adrian looked at the small toy again, then at the boy holding it. His mind was moving through thoughts faster than his expression revealed. 2 years. That meant birthdays, first steps, first words, quiet mornings, small moments that shaped a child's life. All of them had happened somewhere beyond Adrian's awareness. The realization did not strike him with anger or panic. It arrived slowly, settling into his thoughts with the quiet gravity of something undeniable. Around them, the guests seated in the cathedral had begun whispering again, though the tone had shifted. Earlier, their voices carried the excitement of scandal and surprise. Now the whispers felt different, softer, curious in a more thoughtful way. Many of them had expected Adrian Caldwell to react with the sharp authority he used in business negotiations. Instead, they were watching something far more human unfold at the altar. Adrian straightened slightly, his gaze shifting back to Naomi. His voice remained calm. You said you tried to reach me. Naomi nodded once. Adrian continued carefully. Who told you I was traveling? Naomi answered immediately. Your office. Your assistant said you were overseas and unavailable for personal calls. Adrian's eyes narrowed slightly, not with anger, but with concentration. The assistant managing his schedule during that time had been chosen by his father's legal advisors, someone trusted by the Caldwell family long before Adrian took control of the company. Adrian felt the faint edge of a new question forming in his mind. Naomi watched his expression change. There were messages, Adrian. I left several. Adrian asked quietly. Did anyone answer them? Naomi shook her head slowly. No. Adrian fell silent again. The memory of those months returned with greater clarity now. Endless negotiations with investors, late-night meetings with lawyers, constant pressure from the board to protect the company's public image during the attempted takeover. The Caldwell family had always guarded its reputation carefully. Too carefully, Adrian now realized. Naomi continued gently. After a while I stopped trying to reach you through your office. Adrian asked. Why? Naomi looked down at Micah briefly before answering. Because every time I called, someone treated me like I did not belong in your world anymore. The words were not bitter. They carried the calm honesty Naomi had shown from the beginning. Adrian looked away from her for a moment, glancing toward the tall cathedral windows where pale sunlight filtered through stained glass patterns. The thought forming in his mind felt uncomfortable but increasingly unavoidable. If Naomi had tried to reach him and those messages never arrived, then someone had made sure he never heard them. Daniel Hayes spoke quietly from a few steps away. When Naomi came to me, she was not looking for anything complicated. Adrian turned toward him. Daniel continued with the same calm tone he had used since entering the cathedral. She only wanted to make sure her child would have stability. Adrian studied the man for a moment. You believed her immediately. Daniel shrugged slightly. I believed she was telling the truth. Adrian asked. Why? Daniel answered simply. Because people who are lying usually ask for more than a safe place to stay and help finding a doctor. Adrian absorbed the comment silently. Naomi shifted Micah slightly in her arms as the boy grew heavier against her shoulder. The child's eyelids were beginning to droop, the excitement of the unfamiliar room slowly giving way to the natural sleepiness of a toddler who had already experienced a long afternoon. Naomi brushed a curl gently away from his forehead. Adrian noticed the gesture immediately. It was small, almost instinctive, yet it carried the quiet intimacy of 2 years of shared moments he had never seen. Adrian spoke again, his voice steady but thoughtful. Naomi. She lifted her eyes to him. Adrian continued. Why agree to marry me today if you were planning to reveal this? Naomi answered without hesitation. Because I wanted to know if you would face the truth when it mattered most. Adrian looked at the child resting against her shoulder again. Naomi continued softly. If you had chosen reputation over reality today, I would have known exactly what kind of future my son would have with you. The words settled into Adrian's thoughts with quiet precision. Around them the cathedral remained filled with people who had come expecting a ceremony, and instead found themselves witnessing a moment of truth unfolding in real time. Adrian Caldwell had spent years controlling the narrative of his life in public. But standing there beneath the cathedral lights, watching the small boy who carried his features fall asleep against Naomi's shoulder, Adrian realized something profound. This moment was not about the story the world would tell tomorrow. It was about the truth standing directly in front of him now. The cathedral had grown so quiet that the faint ticking of a clock somewhere near the back hallway could almost be heard between breaths. Adrian Caldwell stood beneath the tall stained glass windows with his gaze fixed on the small child resting against Naomi Brooks's shoulder. Micah had grown heavier with sleep during the past few minutes, his small fingers still loosely holding the blue wooden car, while his head rested comfortably against Naomi's collarbone. The long afternoon, the unfamiliar room, and the quiet warmth of his mother's presence had slowly pulled him into a gentle drowsiness that none of the tensions surrounding the altar seemed able to disturb. Naomi adjusted her hold slightly, supporting his weight with practiced ease. 2 years of motherhood had shaped her movements into quiet instincts. She brushed another curl away from Micah's forehead and whispered something softly that only he could hear. The child stirred slightly, but did not wake. Adrian watched the gesture with an intensity that surprised even himself. In the past hour, he had learned more about his own life than he had during the past 2 years. The revelation did not arrive with noise or anger. It arrived quietly, the way truth often did when there was no longer anywhere for it to hide. Around them, the cathedral guests remained seated, but the atmosphere in the room had shifted again. Earlier, there had been whispers filled with curiosity and speculation. Now the voices were softer, almost respectful, as if the people watching understood they were witnessing something more personal than the social spectacle they had expected when they entered the cathedral. Adrian spoke again after a long moment. His voice was steady but thoughtful. Naomi. She lifted her eyes to meet his. Adrian continued carefully. During those months when I was gone, did you ever think about telling the media? Naomi shook her head immediately. No. Adrian studied her expression. Why not? Naomi answered simply. Because my son did not need to become a headline before he could even speak. The honesty of the answer settled into the room with quiet clarity. Adrian knew better than most people how quickly the media could turn personal stories into public entertainment. The fashion industry thrived on attention. A revelation like this could have dominated every magazine and business network in the country within hours. Yet Naomi had chosen silence instead. Adrian looked at Micah again. The boy's breathing had grown slow and steady against Naomi's shoulder. Adrian realized something then that made his thoughts shift once more. Naomi had not protected her own reputation during the past 2 years. She had protected the child. Daniel Hayes spoke quietly from where he stood a few feet away. Naomi turned down 2 magazine offers that would have paid more money than most people earn in 5 years. Adrian glanced toward him. Daniel continued calmly. They heard rumors about her connection to you and wanted an exclusive story. Adrian's eyebrows lifted slightly. Naomi remained silent for a moment before speaking. I told them the same thing every time. Adrian asked quietly. What did you tell them? Naomi answered with calm certainty. I told them my son deserved to grow up before the world started trying to define him. The simplicity of her words seemed to echo through the cathedral more powerfully than any argument could have. Adrian stood very still. In the world he lived in, reputation was currency. Stories could build careers or destroy them overnight. Yet Naomi had refused to trade the truth of her life for attention. Adrian finally asked the question that had been forming in his mind. Naomi, if I had never discovered the truth today, what would you have done? Naomi did not hesitate. I would have raised him the same way I have been raising him since the day he was born. Adrian's voice lowered slightly. Without me. Naomi answered gently. I was never trying to raise him without you. I was raising him until you chose to be part of his life. The distinction struck Adrian with quiet force. Naomi had not tried to replace him. She had simply continued moving forward while his world remained focused somewhere else. Adrian glanced once more toward the pews filled with industry leaders, designers, investors, and journalists who had come expecting to celebrate the union of 2 public figures. Instead, they were watching a moment that had nothing to do with fashion or reputation. Adrian spoke again. His tone had softened, though the authority in his voice remained. Naomi, there is something you should know. She waited patiently. Adrian continued slowly. During those months when I disappeared, I did not decide to cut you out of my life. Naomi studied him carefully, but did not interrupt. Adrian's eyes moved briefly toward the cathedral entrance, as if searching through memories that were only now beginning to connect. I was fighting to keep the company from being forced into a sale. My father's advisors were managing my schedule and communications. Naomi asked quietly. And you trusted them? Adrian answered honestly. At the time, I believed they were protecting the company. Naomi's expression remained calm, though a quiet understanding passed through her eyes. Adrian continued. If someone prevented your messages from reaching me, it means the decision was made intentionally. Daniel Hayes folded his arms thoughtfully. The Caldwell family has always believed reputation should be controlled carefully. Adrian looked toward him again, but did not argue with the observation. Naomi shifted Micah slightly in her arms as the boy stirred again, his small hand tightening around the wooden car before relaxing once more. Adrian watched the child closely. In that moment, he understood something clearly for the first time. The story unfolding inside the cathedral was not only about the past. It was about the future that would follow after the guests left and the headlines faded. Adrian Caldwell had spent years protecting a legacy built on power and influence. Yet standing beneath the stained glass windows with a sleeping child only a few feet away, Adrian realized that legacy meant very little if he did not first learn how to be present in the life of the boy who carried his name. The quiet inside the cathedral had taken on a different quality now. It was no longer the stunned silence of surprise. It was the heavy stillness that follows when a room full of people realizes they are witnessing a moment that will change the direction of several lives at once. Adrian Caldwell remained standing only a few feet away from Naomi Brooks, his gaze moving slowly between her and the child sleeping peacefully against her shoulder. Micah's breathing had grown deep and even, the soft rhythm of sleep completely untouched by the tension surrounding the altar. One of his small shoes had slipped slightly loose as he rested against Naomi, and the wooden car he held earlier now hung gently from his relaxed fingers. Naomi adjusted the child again with careful ease, supporting his back with one hand while her other arm held him securely. Her wedding dress brushed softly across the marble floor with the movement, the long fabric catching faint reflections from the stained glass windows high above them. Adrian watched the quiet maternal gesture with focused attention. During the past 2 years, he had spent thousands of hours inside boardrooms and design studios, making decisions that shaped global fashion campaigns and corporate strategy. Yet in that moment, he realized something simple and unavoidable. Naomi had spent those same 2 years shaping a human life. The contrast between those realities settled into Adrian's thoughts with surprising weight. Around them, the guests seated throughout the cathedral continued watching, though many now appeared uncertain whether they should remain witnesses to such an intimate conversation. A few people had quietly lowered their phones, recognizing that the moment unfolding at the altar had moved far beyond the spectacle they originally expected. Adrian spoke again, his voice steady but thoughtful. "Naomi." She looked at him calmly. Adrian continued slowly. "When Micah was born, who was there with you?" Naomi answered without hesitation. "Daniel." Adrian glanced toward Daniel Hayes again. The rival executive remained standing near the aisle with composed patience, his posture relaxed but attentive. Daniel met Adrian's gaze briefly and nodded once. Adrian asked him quietly, "You were at the hospital?" Daniel answered simply, "Yes." Adrian looked back at Naomi. "Your family was not with you." Naomi shook her head gently. "My mother passed away several years ago, and my father lives in another state. At that time, I did not want to bring him into a situation that would only worry him." Adrian absorbed that information silently. Naomi continued softly. "Daniel drove me to the hospital and stayed until Micah was born." Adrian looked toward Daniel again, studying the man with new understanding. In the fashion industry, they had been competitors for years, each company challenging the other for market influence and creative leadership. Yet the man standing across the aisle had been present during the most important moment of Adrian's own son's life. Adrian spoke carefully. "You did not have to do that." Daniel shrugged slightly. "No one should go through something like that alone." Adrian said nothing for several seconds. Naomi's eyes remained on him, observing the subtle shift in his expression. Adrian had always been skilled at hiding emotion behind controlled composure. But the calm structure of that composure had begun to change since Micah entered the cathedral. Adrian spoke. Again, quieter this time. "Naomi, did Micah ever ask about his father?" Naomi answered honestly. "Not yet. He is still too young to understand what that question means." Adrian nodded slowly. Naomi continued gently. "But one day he will ask." Adrian looked at the child again. The small boy stirred slightly in his sleep, shifting his head against Naomi's shoulder before settling again. Adrian felt a quiet heaviness form in his chest. For 2 years this child had existed in the world without him. The realization did not feel like an accusation. It felt like a responsibility that had finally revealed itself. Adrian spoke carefully. "Naomi, if I had not received that message before the ceremony, would you still have told me today?" Naomi met his gaze without hesitation. "Yes." Adrian asked. "Even if it destroyed the wedding?" Naomi answered with calm certainty. "I was never afraid of losing a wedding. I was afraid of my son growing up without knowing the truth about where he came from." The honesty of the statement settled deeply into the room. Adrian looked down briefly at the marble floor, then back at Naomi. Naomi continued quietly. "Adrian, I did not come here to embarrass you or to create a spectacle in front of your world. I came because you were about to promise something permanent while a piece of your life was missing." Adrian inhaled slowly. The cathedral lights reflected faintly across the polished marble beneath his shoes. His thoughts were moving through possibilities and consequences with the same careful precision he used in corporate negotiations. Yet this situation was unlike anything he had ever faced in business. Naomi shifted Micah slightly again as the child stirred awake for a moment. His eyes opened halfway, blinking slowly as he looked around the enormous cathedral with quiet confusion. Naomi smiled gently. "It is all right, sweetheart." Micah's gaze drifted briefly toward Adrian before he rested his head against Naomi again, still half asleep. Adrian felt something shift inside him when the child looked in his direction. The moment was brief, but it carried a quiet connection Adrian could not ignore. Adrian spoke again, his voice steadier now. "Naomi, if everything you said is true, then someone prevented me from knowing about my own child." Naomi nodded once. "That is what I believe happened." Adrian glanced again toward the rows of guests, then toward the cathedral doors, his thoughts already moving toward the implications of that possibility. The Caldwell family had spent decades building a reputation based on control, influence, and careful management of information. If someone inside that system had hidden Naomi's messages from him, then the truth about Micah had been buried intentionally. Adrian returned his attention to Naomi and the child resting in her arms. For the first time since the ceremony began, Adrian Caldwell understood something clearly. The future standing in front of him was not defined by the wedding that had just collapsed beneath the cathedral lights. It was defined by the small boy who had just opened his eyes and looked at him for the very first time. The afternoon light inside the cathedral had begun to soften, stretching through the stained glass windows in long bands of muted color that spilled across the marble floor. The ceremony that had been planned with perfect precision had dissolved completely, yet no one had left their seat. Hundreds of guests remained watching in quiet stillness as Adrian Caldwell stood at the altar facing Naomi Brooks and the small child who had just opened his eyes again in slow curiosity. Micah blinked softly, still half caught between sleep and wakefulness, his tiny hand lifting the blue wooden car, as if reminding himself that the object was still there. Naomi adjusted him gently, whispering something soft near his ear. The boy nodded faintly and rested his cheek against her shoulder once more, though his eyes stayed open now, wandering across the cathedral ceiling before settling once again on the tall man standing a few feet away. Adrian felt the child's gaze with surprising clarity. For years he had walked through rooms filled with people who watched him with admiration, ambition, or calculation. But the way Micah looked at him carried none of those expectations. It was simply curiosity. Pure, unfiltered curiosity from a child who did not yet understand reputation, business empires, or the complicated world of adults. Adrian spoke quietly. "Micah." The boy lifted his head slightly again when he heard his name. Adrian hesitated for a moment, something unfamiliar passing through his normally controlled thoughts. Then he stepped a little closer. The movement was small but noticeable. Naomi remained still, allowing the moment to unfold naturally. Adrian lowered himself again, so his eyes were closer to the child's level. "Hello." Micah studied him carefully for a moment, then slowly extended the wooden car again, as if repeating the earlier introduction. Adrian accepted the small toy with both hands this time. The object felt unexpectedly meaningful in his palm. He rolled the tiny wheels with his thumb, then returned the car to Micah. The boy nodded again with quiet approval. Around them, the guests seated in the cathedral continued watching, though the mood had shifted into something calmer and more reflective. The initial shock had faded into the quiet recognition that they were witnessing a moment of truth that could not be rehearsed or staged. Adrian stood again, turning his attention back to Naomi. His voice carried a steadiness that had returned, but the tone had changed. "Naomi, the message I received before the ceremony came with a photograph." Naomi's expression did not change, though she listened carefully. Adrian continued. "It showed a child with eyes that looked very familiar." Naomi nodded slightly. "Someone must have wanted to make sure you saw the truth today." Adrian's gaze drifted briefly toward the rows of guests. The Caldwell name had always carried influence that stretched far beyond fashion. Business rivals, investors, and media figures all watched the family closely. Any number of people could have wanted the truth revealed at the most visible moment possible. Adrian looked back at Naomi. "Did you send that message?" Naomi shook her head. "No. I planned to tell you myself when the ceremony began. Adrian considered that quietly. Daniel Hayes stepped forward slightly, though he remained respectful of the space between them. I received a call earlier this morning from someone who refused to give their name, Daniel said calmly. Adrian turned toward him. The caller asked whether Naomi would still attend the ceremony. Adrian asked slowly, "And what did you tell them?" Daniel answered with a faint shrug. "I told them Naomi always keeps her word." Adrian absorbed that information without comment. The realization forming in his mind grew clearer with every passing minute. Someone had orchestrated the revelation to happen in the most public way possible. Yet the presence of Micah had shifted the entire meaning of the moment. This was no longer a scandal or a strategic attack. It was a child standing quietly at the center of two lives that had been separated by decisions neither of them fully understood at the time. Adrian looked at Naomi again. "If someone inside my family prevented your messages from reaching me, then they believed they were protecting something." Naomi answered softly, "Your reputation." Adrian nodded slowly. "That would not surprise me." The Caldwell family had built its influence over generations by controlling information carefully. Naomi adjusted Micah again as the boy shifted in her arms. He had grown more alert now, his eyes moving between the faces around him with growing interest. Adrian spoke again, his tone quieter but more deliberate. "Naomi, I cannot change what happened during the past 2 years." Naomi listened without interrupting. Adrian continued, "But I can decide what happens next." The words settled into the cathedral like a quiet turning point. Naomi studied his expression carefully. Adrian looked at Micah once more before speaking again. "My son deserves to know that he was never something I would have hidden if I had known the truth." Naomi's voice remained calm. "Then the question now is simple." Adrian raised his eyes to meet hers. Naomi finished quietly. "What kind of father will you choose to become?" Adrian felt the weight of the question more deeply than any boardroom challenge he had ever faced. The answer would not appear in a contract or negotiation strategy. It would reveal itself through actions that would stretch far beyond this cathedral. Adrian looked down at Micah again. The boy had begun pushing the wooden car slowly across Naomi's shoulder, completely absorbed in the small game he had invented for himself. Adrian extended his hand gently. Micah paused and looked up at him. Adrian spoke softly. "Would you like to show me how fast it goes?" Micah considered the question seriously for a moment before carefully placing the toy car into Adrian's hand again. The child's quiet trust moved through Adrian with unexpected force. Naomi watched the exchange silently. In that moment, she saw something she had hoped for during the long months of uncertainty after Micah was born. Adrian Caldwell was no longer standing in front of her as the powerful executive who controlled one of the largest fashion companies in the world. He was standing there as a man realizing that his future had quietly expanded in a way no business decision could ever match. The cathedral lights glowed softly above the altar as Adrian Caldwell stood holding the small blue wooden car in his hand. The object looked almost insignificant against the dark fabric of his tailored suit. Yet in that moment it carried a meaning far greater than any luxury item that had ever passed through the doors of Caldwell Atelier. Micah watched him carefully, his dark eyes following the movement of the toy as Adrian rolled it slowly across his palm. The boy leaned slightly forward in Naomi's arms, curious about what the tall man would do next. Adrian lowered his hand gently until the car rested on the marble edge of the altar. Then he pushed it forward across the smooth surface with a quiet motion. The small wheels spun softly. Micah's face brightened immediately. The simple gesture seemed to erase the lingering tension between them. The boy stretched his hand forward with excitement and nudged the toy car back toward Adrian again. The exchange was quiet, almost playful, yet everyone in the cathedral could feel the shift it created. Naomi watched the interaction carefully. The child resting in her arms had grown comfortable again, his curiosity replacing the sleepiness that had briefly taken over earlier. For the first time since the ceremony had stopped, Naomi felt the tight weight in her chest ease slightly. Adrian pushed the toy car back once more, slower this time. As if he were learning the rhythm of a small game neither of them had planned to play inside a cathedral filled with fashion executives and media observers. Micah giggled softly when the car reached him again. The sound was light and bright, echoing gently through the large stone chamber. Adrian felt something unexpected move through him when he heard that laugh. It was simple and unguarded in a way that reminded him of a world that existed completely outside boardrooms and negotiations. Naomi shifted Micah slightly, so he could sit more comfortably on her hip. The child's attention remained focused entirely on the small game happening between his hand and Adrian's. Around them the guests remained silent, though their expressions had softened noticeably. Many of the people seated in the pews had built careers around analyzing fashion trends and corporate influence. Yet none of those skills seemed relevant in this moment. They were watching a father and son discover each other through the quiet language of small gestures. Adrian finally lifted the toy car again and handed it directly back to Micah. The boy accepted it proudly and held it close against his chest. Adrian spoke gently. "That is a fast car." Micah nodded with serious enthusiasm. "Fast." The word came out softly but clearly. Naomi smiled faintly. "He learned that word last week." Adrian looked at her. Naomi continued quietly. "He says it every time he pushes the car across the living room floor." Adrian glanced at the child again, picturing the scene she described. A small living room somewhere in Manhattan. A toddler pushing a toy car across the floor while Naomi watched nearby. The image felt strangely vivid in his mind despite the fact that he had never seen it himself. Adrian spoke slowly. "Naomi, where have you been living during the past 2 years?" Naomi answered calmly. "A small apartment near Riverside Park." Adrian nodded slightly. The location was only a few miles from his own penthouse, yet the distance between their lives during that time had been enormous. Daniel Hayes spoke quietly from a few steps away. "Naomi built a stable life there." Adrian looked toward him. Daniel continued. "She found work organizing events for several small design houses. Nothing connected to Caldwell Atelier or Hayes Collective." Naomi added gently. "I did not want my work to become a topic of gossip connected to you." Adrian understood the meaning immediately. Naomi had protected both the child and his reputation by staying away from the powerful circles that defined his world. Adrian looked down at Micah again. The boy had begun pushing the wooden car along Naomi's arm now, completely absorbed in the simple motion of the spinning wheels. Adrian spoke softly. "Does he like the park?" Naomi nodded. "Very much. There is a playground near the river where he likes to watch the boats." Adrian felt the quiet simplicity of that detail settle into his thoughts. While he had been traveling between global fashion capitals, his son had been standing beside the Hudson River watching boats pass through the water. Naomi continued gently. "Sometimes he waves to the people on the boats even though they cannot see him." Adrian smiled faintly at the image. It was the first time his expression had softened enough for the people watching to notice the change clearly. Naomi saw it as well. Adrian straightened slightly and looked back at her. His voice carried a calm steadiness that had returned fully now. "Naomi, I cannot undo the past 2 years." Naomi listened without interrupting. Adrian continued carefully. "But I will not allow the next 20 years to pass the same way." The words hung in the air between them. Naomi studied his expression closely. Adrian's gaze shifted briefly toward the rows of guests filling the cathedral. His voice grew slightly firmer. "The people in this room know me as a man who controls outcomes and protects his legacy." Adrian paused for a moment before looking back at Naomi and the child. "But the most important legacy I have now is standing right in front of me." Micah looked up again when Adrian spoke, his attention drawn by the sound of his voice. Adrian crouched slightly once more so he was closer to the child's level. "Hello again, Micah." The boy tilted his head curiously, then lifted the wooden car once more as if offering it for another round of the game. Adrian accepted it with a quiet smile. Naomi watched the exchange in silence. Around them the cathedral remained filled with witnesses who had arrived expecting to celebrate a wedding. Instead, they were watching something far more meaningful unfold. Adrian Caldwell had spent years building a powerful empire in the fashion world. Yet in that quiet moment beside the altar, he had begun building something far more personal. A connection with the small boy who had just discovered that the tall stranger across the marble floor was someone who might soon become a permanent part of his life. The quiet inside the cathedral had transformed into something almost reflective, as if the hundreds of people seated in the long rows of pews understood they were witnessing the final turning point of a story none of them had expected when they arrived earlier that afternoon. Adrian Caldwell stood near the altar with the small wooden car resting once again in Micah's hands, the child's attention still focused on the simple joy of rolling the toy along Naomi's arm. The soft wheels clicked faintly against the delicate fabric of her dress, creating a gentle rhythm that somehow felt more meaningful than the music that had been planned for the ceremony. Naomi Brooks remained steady beneath the tall, stained glass windows, holding her son with the same calm presence she had carried throughout the entire confrontation. The sunlight had shifted again, and now the colored glass above them cast faint patterns of blue and gold across the marble floor. Adrian looked at those reflections for a moment before lifting his eyes back to Naomi. During the past hour, he had watched his carefully planned life shift in directions he never imagined. Yet standing there now, the confusion that once filled his thoughts had slowly settled into clarity. Adrian spoke with quiet seriousness. "Naomi, there is something else we need to talk about before anyone in this room decides what story they will tell tomorrow." Naomi nodded slightly. Adrian continued. "Someone made sure I saw that photograph before the ceremony began." Naomi said softly. "Yes." Adrian glanced briefly toward the rows of guests, many of whom were already beginning to realize that the story unfolding here had moved beyond the personal moment between a father and a child. It now carried implications about power, reputation, and the hidden decisions made behind the scenes of influential families. Adrian spoke slowly. "If someone prevented your messages from reaching me 2 years ago, then they believed they were protecting the Caldwell name." Naomi watched him carefully. Adrian continued. "But if that same person wanted the truth revealed today, it means something has changed." Daniel Hayes shifted slightly where he stood near the aisle. Adrian turned toward him. Daniel said calmly, "When powerful families try to control every piece of information, eventually the truth finds its own path out." Adrian nodded once. He understood that principle well. The fashion industry was built on image, but image could only survive as long as reality remained hidden. Adrian returned his attention to Naomi. His voice was steady. "Naomi, I believe someone inside my own family knew about Micah long before today." Naomi did not look surprised by the possibility. Adrian continued. "And they decided to keep that truth away from me while the company was under pressure." Naomi spoke quietly. That would not be the first time powerful people decided which truths were convenient. Adrian accepted the observation without argument. Micah had grown more awake now, the earlier sleepiness completely gone. He leaned slightly forward in Naomi's arms, holding the wooden car in both hands as if he had discovered a new game. Adrian crouched again so he could meet the child's eyes more closely. "Hello again." Micah studied him with the same calm curiosity as before. Adrian extended his hand gently. The boy placed the toy car in it without hesitation. Adrian rolled the tiny wheels again, then looked up at Naomi. The calm simplicity of the moment gave his next words a deeper weight. "Naomi, there is one thing I know for certain now." Naomi waited quietly. Adrian continued. "No one gets to decide whether I am part of my son's life except the two people standing here. Naomi and Micah." Naomi held his gaze for a long moment. She had spent 2 years preparing herself for the possibility that Adrian might reject the truth or attempt to push it aside for the sake of his public image. But the man standing in front of her now looked different from the one she remembered before he disappeared from her life. Adrian's attention returned briefly to the rows of guests. His voice became slightly firmer, though it remained calm. Everyone in this room came expecting a wedding today. Instead, they witnessed something far more important. Adrian looked back at Naomi and Micah, the beginning of a family learning the truth about itself. Naomi felt the quiet sincerity behind his words. Micah reached forward again and took the toy car back from Adrian's hand, rolling it across the marble edge of the altar with the serious concentration that only small children seemed able to maintain. Adrian watched him for a moment before standing again. The calm strength in his posture had returned fully now, but it no longer carried the distance that once separated him from the people around him. Adrian spoke quietly to Naomi. "There will be questions after today." Naomi nodded. "I expected that." Adrian continued. "Reporters, business partners, maybe even my own board of directors will want to know what happens next." Naomi's voice remained steady. "The only people who truly need to know that answer are the ones standing here." Adrian looked at Micah again. The boy had begun making soft engine sounds as he pushed the toy car along the marble surface, completely absorbed in the simple activity. Adrian felt a faint smile appear again before he spoke once more. "Naomi, would you be willing to bring Micah to the park tomorrow morning?" Naomi raised an eyebrow slightly. "The park?" Adrian nodded. Riverside Park. Naomi's eyes softened a little. That is where he likes to watch the boats. Adrian replied quietly. Then that seems like a good place to begin. Learning how to be part of his world. Naomi considered the suggestion for a moment before nodding slowly. Micah lifted the toy car and held it toward Adrian again, as if approving the plan in the only language he understood. Adrian accepted the toy one more time. Around them, the cathedral remained silent. The people seated in the pews recognizing that the moment unfolding at the altar had reached its natural conclusion. The wedding that was supposed to define the day had quietly disappeared, replaced by something far more meaningful. Adrian Caldwell had built an empire around fashion and reputation, but standing there beneath the stained glass windows with a small toy car in his hand and his son only a few steps away, he understood that the most important legacy of his life had just begun. The cathedral remained wrapped in a quiet stillness that felt almost sacred now. The sunlight filtering through the tall stained glass windows had softened into the gentle glow of late afternoon, casting long colors across the marble floor where Adrian Caldwell, Naomi Brooks, and the small boy between them stood at the center of a moment none of them had planned, yet all of them now understood. Micah had climbed slightly higher onto Naomi's shoulder, his small fingers still gripping the blue wooden car as he studied the tall man, standing a few steps away. The child's curiosity had not faded, but it had grown calmer, the way children often settle once they sense the world around them is safe. Naomi brushed a curl away from Micah's forehead and watched Adrian quietly. For the first time since the ceremony began, the tension that had lived behind her eyes had completely disappeared. What remained instead was something simpler and steadier. Adrian Caldwell looked different now than the man who had stood at the altar earlier that afternoon, prepared to begin a wedding that seemed certain and controlled. His posture still carried the calm authority that had built one of the most influential fashion companies in the world, but the distance that once surrounded him had quietly disappeared. Adrian glanced around the cathedral slowly. Hundreds of people remained seated in the pews, though none of them spoke. Many had lowered their phones entirely now, recognizing that the story unfolding before them had grown too personal to capture through a screen. Adrian finally spoke, his voice calm but clear enough to reach every corner of the cathedral. I believe everyone here understands that the ceremony we planned today will not continue the way it was written. A faint ripple of movement passed through the room, but no one interrupted him. Adrian continued slowly. Today was supposed to be about promises. But promises mean very little if they are built on missing truth. Naomi listened quietly beside him, her attention focused not on the audience, but on the child in her arms. Adrian looked at Micah again before speaking the next words. 2 years ago, a part of my life began without me knowing it existed. Adrian paused briefly, allowing the weight of the statement to settle. And today I was given the chance to finally see that truth standing in front of me. Micah lifted the wooden car again, as if responding to the sound of Adrian's voice. Adrian accepted the toy once more with a faint smile and rolled the tiny wheels gently before returning it to the boy. The simple exchange felt almost symbolic now, a quiet agreement between them that did not require complicated words. Adrian turned back to Naomi. His voice softened slightly. Naomi, you asked earlier what kind of father I would choose to become. Naomi met his gaze steadily. Adrian continued. I cannot rewrite the past 2 years, but I can begin learning how to be present for every year that follows. Naomi felt the sincerity in his voice and nodded once. That is all I ever hoped you would choose. Adrian looked down at Micah again. The boy leaned forward and pushed the wooden car across the marble edge of the altar once more, making a soft engine sound that echoed gently through the cathedral. Adrian crouched beside him again, watching the tiny wheels spin. Micah looked up and said one word with quiet excitement. Fast. Adrian laughed softly under his breath, a sound so natural that several people seated in the pews exchanged surprised glances. Yes, he said gently. Very fast. Naomi shifted Micah slightly so the boy could stand on the marble floor beside her. The child wobbled for a moment before finding his balance, then immediately pushed the toy car along the smooth stone surface between himself and Adrian. Adrian watched the child's determined little steps and felt something inside his chest settle into place. The world he had built around contracts and reputation suddenly seemed smaller than the moment happening in front of him. Adrian stood again and turned toward the rows of guests. His voice remained calm, but carried a quiet strength. For those of you who came here expecting a wedding, I appreciate the respect you have shown by staying through a moment none of us expected. But the truth revealed today deserves more dignity than turning it into tomorrow's headline. The room remained silent. Adrian continued, I will handle the questions that follow in my own time. Today belongs to my son. Naomi watched him carefully. The statement had not been rehearsed or planned, yet it carried the clarity of a decision Adrian had fully accepted. Daniel Hayes stepped forward slightly, offering Naomi a supportive nod before preparing to leave the altar area quietly. Adrian noticed the movement and spoke before Daniel could walk away. Daniel. Daniel paused and turned back. Adrian met his eyes directly. Thank you for helping Naomi when I was not there. Daniel gave a small nod in return. Anyone would have done the same. Adrian answered calmly. Not everyone did. The simple exchange carried more meaning than either man needed to explain further. Micah had begun walking slowly toward the wide aisle now, the wooden car rolling ahead of him across the marble floor. Naomi moved quickly to steady him before he could wander too far. Adrian followed them without hesitation. As they reached the edge of the aisle, Micah looked back at Adrian and lifted the toy car once again as if inviting him to continue the game. Adrian knelt and gently pushed the car forward down the aisle between them. The wheels spun smoothly across the polished stone. Micah laughed and chased after it with careful little steps. Naomi watched the moment unfold with quiet warmth. The cathedral that had been prepared for a wedding had instead become the place where something far more meaningful began. Adrian Caldwell had built his life around power, influence, and reputation. But as he stood watching his son push a small wooden car down the long aisle beneath the fading afternoon light, he understood that the most important promise he would ever make was not spoken at an altar. It would be proven one ordinary moment at a time.